Half a Sixpence is a musical about a young man who finds himself the recipient of a good-sized inheritance. He doesn't fit in naturally with his wealthy peers, and he has to figure out how to navigate his newfound riches. Like so many musicals, this is a long movie to be able to fit in all the tunes, but not a single one of these songs is a throwaway. Even the songs that in any other musical would have been time killers at best, I'm thinking particularly of Flashbang and Money to Burn, they become absolutely enthralling to watch here. I attribute most of that to Tommy Steele's magnetic energy. It'd be easy for him to just become too much in a movie, but here he brings a sense of joy to every song he's in, and made every single song thoroughly enjoyable. The rest of the cast is good as well, but it's very definitely Steele who carries the movie, and he does it very well. It's the first musical I've seen in a while where I left genuinely wanting to find a cast album so I could get to know those songs better. It's too bad this one isn't better known. It's really delightful. Eat, Drink, Man, Woman is an Ang Lee film about a family in modern-day Taiwan. The father owns a restaurant and has 3 adult daughters, all of whom still live at home. The plot is more of a series of vignettes about the family's life, but they focus most heavily on the father, who is losing his sense of taste and can no longer cook like he used to, and the middle daughter, who is itching to move away from the family but keeps coming up against obstacles. This is a slow, thoughtful movie that spends much of its time lingering on the sights and sounds of the father's cooking. Details of the various daughters' approaches to life and to their father unravel a little at a time, and sometimes interacting with each other in interesting ways. One daughter, for example, begins seeing the man who jilted her older sister years before without knowing it's him, and when she finds out, you're concerned for both of them and how this is going to play out. The final scene is very touching and beautiful, and it ends the film perfectly. Overall, just a really beautiful movie. Sweet Charity is a musical about a young dance hall hostess named Charity. She wants to find true love and get out of her job, but her optimism about the world leads to a lot of disappointment, and we get to see all of it. If you're thinking that sounds exceptionally depressing for a musical, you would be right. It's based on the Italian film Nights of Cabiria, which I do love, but this one hit me on a very different level, and I found I couldn't enjoy any of the big musical numbers because I remembered where the story was heading. Mild spoiler, the ending here is at very best bittersweet, and at worst absolutely devastating. Shirley MacLaine does turn in a great performance. She brings a ton of energetic physicality to her role, but the best parts of this movie are the group musical numbers featuring stage veterans Cheetah Rivera, Paula Kelly, and Stubby Kaye, and for one number, Sammy Davis Jr. Those numbers are fantastic, a nice distraction from the absolute non-cathartic misery of the core story. I sound more negative about this than maybe I should be, but I just had such a difficult time enjoying any of Charity's highs, knowing the lows were on their way. I'm a little curious how I would have felt if I went in blind, but as it is, I don't want to rewatch it. Twister is about a group of tornado chasers. They've created a piece of tech that will allow them to study a tornado's internal workings, but the only catch is that the tech has to be picked up by the tornado to transmit that data. So the group runs around to various tornado sightings trying to get close enough to put the tech in its way, but not so close that they also get trapped in it. There's also some romantic drama involving the 2 leads and their breakup. I was terrified to watch this movie when I was younger, as I grew up in the Midwest where tornadoes are a fairly common occurrence, and though thankfully we never got this close to one, I was still so scared of them. This film sets up a series of properly terrifying scenes that hit home for me. There's one moment in particular where a character looks up at a black sky that seems harmless only for a flash of lightning to subtly illuminate the tornado that's right there in front of her. That is something directly out of my nightmares. This film is a wild ride, but it paces itself very well, and it delivers on those big scary moments, which is all it really needed to do to accomplish its goals. Long Day's Journey into Night is Sidney Lumet's take on the classic Eugene O'Neill play, a semi-autobiographical story about a family with a mother hooked on morphine, a brother who was a drunk, another brother who was dying of consumption, and a father who is disappointed in all of them to varying degrees. It's often considered one of the greatest American plays in existence, and there's certainly a lot to be gleaned from it, especially for any of the actors taking it on. You do have to be prepared to lean into this style, though. It's very reminiscent of classical plays. Greek tragedies come to mind most strongly, with these long poetic monologues taking the place of any semblance of realistic speech, and characters don't seem to be interacting with each other so much as existing out loud near each other, which definitely brings out the sense of isolation and every man for himself within the family. Lumet keeps the theatrical staging in translating it to film, but makes incredible use of lighting to narrow in on these characters as they feel more and more trapped in the life they have. The film won't resonate with everyone, but it definitely grew on me as I watched it. Nobody stars Bob Odenkirk as a passive, mild-mannered family man. In the opening scene, he chooses to not attack a home invader and gets mercilessly mocked for it by his son and brother-in-law. It turns out, however, that he has a secret, much more violent past that he's been keeping from his family. On one level, this is just your typical action thriller. Critics have largely praised Odenkirk's performance here, and I completely agree. He sells both aspects of his character's persona, and the action sequences are that sort of high-octane, extra-violent creativity most associated with directors like Quentin Tarantino. They're certainly fun to watch, but I found myself missing the movie that had been set up for me at the beginning. I don't think we actually need any more revenge fantasies from middle-class American fathers. I wanted to see the story of Odenkirk's character when he truly was nobody, and as it became clear that it was going to become an action movie and was about to lapse into something much more familiar, I lost most of my interest in the character and his story. Funny how sometimes adding more action makes a story less interesting. Hair is the film version of the notorious 1960s Broadway musical about the peace movement in the US. The movie makes some significant plot changes and focuses on a small group of hippies, including one high society woman and one conservative draftee who ends up becoming part of the hippie tribe. There's a loose plot to the film, but mostly they just dance around doing drugs and singing protest songs. The stage version has even less of a plot, and I think the movie made some good choices in narrowing the focus of the characters, even though the original creators didn't like how it focused on the small group instead of the broader picture. The film shouldn't have worked, at all, and yet it mostly does. It's able to retain a lot of the dreamy, non-linear vibe through the staging of the musical numbers. Manchester, England, and the Black Boys, White Boys montage come to mind in particular, but then it grounds the story in the choices of a few specific characters, and the result is kind of electrifying. By the time it got to the end, I was riveted. I really had low expectations of this one, as the show had never really gripped me, but this interpretation works for me. Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always is the story of a teenage girl who finds out she's pregnant and sets out to terminate the pregnancy without her parents' knowledge. She and her cousin travel by bus to New York City, where she can legally get treatment without parental consent, and thus begins 2 days of setbacks, unexpected expenses, and stressful encounters. I'm impressed by how much story and depth we get to this character with so little dialogue. Autumn's refusal to speak more than 1 or 2 words at a time, and even those reluctantly, portrays so much about how guarded she is and how terrified she is to have to be in this situation and ask someone else for help. And the movie doesn't provide any easy answers either. The title comes from a questionnaire one clinic's nurse gives Autumn to check for domestic violence or sexual assault, and it's clear that whatever caused Autumn's current situation, it's one where she feels very unsafe, and the film doesn't resolve that. We end with one crisis down, the next one just around the corner. It's a powerful but often deeply sad film. A Room with a View tells the story of a young woman in the early 20th century who has an unexpected and slightly scandalous brush with romance on a trip to Florence. After she returns home and gets engaged to a very respectable local man, her Florence romantic partner appears and she has to decide what she really wants. This is based on a novel by E.M. Forster that I just read myself a few months ago, and I found it much more exciting and charming than I expected at first. The film does its best to capture that feeling of a turn-of-the-century romance, even including chapter headings in between its various scenes, and that's pretty delightful. On film, the romance feels a bit more expected than it did on the page, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, just a change I noticed. Helena Bonham Carter is a joy here, portraying exactly the right combination of independence and uncertainty as she navigates her own thoughts and feelings, and the rest of the cast is stellar as well. And the 2 locations here are very much characters of their own, and the cinematography really lets them shine. Overall, a really nicely done film. Clear and Present Danger is a spy action thriller about CIA Deputy Director Jack Ryan, in which Ryan is asked to investigate a mysterious death that ends up being linked to a Colombian drug cartel. He delves in to investigate the matter further, slowly uncovering that a covert war against the cartel is being hidden from him. This is for the most part your typical spy action thriller, and I will say up front that this is not my genre. Lots and lots of pieces, lots and lots of gunfights, lots and lots of names being thrown around and characters switching sides, none of which would be difficult to track if I cared, but I usually don't. It does delve into some interesting themes near the end about government overreach and abuse of power, but those are definitely meant to take a back seat to the action sequences. Harrison Ford is great here. He so often gets to play tough and jaded characters in action films, but here he brings a refreshing amount of earnestness to the role, which is when I like him the most. I'd expect fans of the genre to like this more than I did, but I can see what it does well. Rescue Me focuses on 2 teenagers, a wannabe photographer and the popular girl he's in love with. When he sees her being kidnapped, he takes it upon himself to track her down and rescue her with the help of somebody. I think I might have missed something, but maybe the movie is just confused, because I couldn't figure out how the kid found anyone the kidnappers knew, but he convinces that guy to come along and help out in rescuing her. This movie is sleazy. For one thing, the film's hero only sees the kidnapping because he'd gone to that spot to creepily take pictures of her skinny dipping without her knowledge. And then there are multiple scenes of grown adults hitting on these teenage characters and more, which is just portrayed as a totally okay, totally cool thing in this film, but I found it pretty horrifying. Some of the scenes with the kidnappers were mildly amusing, and the kidnapped girl definitely takes back her agency throughout the film, which is cool, but there's just a lot of stuff in here that has aged very uncomfortably and made it impossible to enjoy, even if the rest of it were better, which it's not. This isn't good. Backbeat tells the story of the Beatles' Hamburg period before they got famous, told mostly through the eyes of their first bassist, Stu Sutcliffe, and his friendship with John Lennon. I knew virtually nothing about this time in the band's career, and the film does a pretty good job of telling it as a straightforward story without trying to make it a big Beatles biopic. Yes, there are definitely a few moments where they casually drop the name of a future song into dialogue, but it feels surprisingly natural most of the time. Most importantly, Stephen Dorff as Sutcliffe and Ian Hart as Lennon really sell the story here. They bring these characters to life in a way that made me instantly sympathize with them and want to know where their journey would take them. The movie does a great job of centering the music as well, devoting plenty of time to showing the band performing, though of course not with any of the songs we know them from today. This was before they were written. The editing, cinematography, and sound all combine to do a really great job of showing off what made the Beatles special in those early days before we knew everything they could do. It's a lot more engaging than most biopics. I definitely recommend it. The Little Things is a crime drama thriller starring Denzel Washington as a detective who returns to his former precinct and helps his replacement, played by Rami Malek, work the case of a possible serial killer. Washington is preoccupied with unsolved cases from his past and thinks these new murders might be connected, and Malek is eager to learn from his predecessor, who was a big deal in the department until he worked himself into a heart attack and left. This movie wants to be Seven so badly, and it definitely has a few moments of successfully latching on to those creepy vibes, particularly in the third act, but it also doesn't have Seven's clarity of purpose or story, and so we get a lot of plot twistiness that doesn't go anywhere, as well as some muddled character arcs. It was one of those films where afterward I went and looked up the plot on Wikipedia to explain the pieces I missed, and they didn't have any more information than I did. Both the lead actors pull out all the stops, and Washington is of course very good at playing this sort of moral ambiguity. If you're a huge fan of the genre, this is a decent addition, but if you're looking for something above and beyond, this falls short. Onward is a Pixar film about two teenaged elf brothers living in a world very similar to our own, except full of mythical creatures. Magic existed there as well, but got phased out with technology, so when the brothers discover a spell to bring their dead father back for one day, they jump at the chance. Things go wrong, they end up only animating half of him, and the three set out on a journey to get the materials to fix the spell and do it right. Pixar is at its best when tapping into the human stories beneath the fancy trappings, and this does an incredible job with that. The fantasy quest here is the method of telling the story of two brothers growing up without a dad, and the method works well, but the reason the film succeeds is that the story underneath is strong. The world itself is one I would have dismissed as lazy if it weren't handled as intelligently as it is, but it works and helps support the primary story without ever overwhelming it. The characters are likable and relatable, and I definitely teared up at the end, although not the full-on sobbing some Pixar films have reduced me to. A pretty solid entry for the studio. Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar stars Kristen Wiig and Annie Mumolo as middle-aged best friends Barb and Star, who end up going on the vacation of a lifetime after losing their jobs. Their trip overlaps with the supervillain's plan to kill everyone in Vista Del Mar as revenge for her unhappy childhood there, so of course they then have to help stop that. I appreciated but didn't love Wiig and Mumolo's previous writing collaboration Bridesmaids, but this one was right up my alley. It's like if Anchorman decided to cross over with, I don't know, some delightful movie about female friendship. There's such a great mix here of character-centric humor and just wild, wacky moments that made me laugh out loud. The romantic lead's musical number was especially a favorite, but it also has such lovely warmth to it, even if the big cathartic moments come while the leads are being chased off a cliff by alligators, rather than a more traditional dramatic setup. I did have to go back and edit this review pretty heavily because I just kept describing everything as delightful, so I had to find some more creative words, but really, that is the best word I could use to describe this film. It's delightful. Malcolm and Marie tells the story of one night in a couple's relationship. Malcolm is a filmmaker coming home from the successful premiere of his directorial debut, and Marie is his girlfriend, a former drug addict who was largely the inspiration for his new film. The two alternately fight and flirt, but mostly fight. The result is a talky piece that would feel right at home in a black box theater. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf comes to mind as an immediate comparison, but there's a possibility Malcolm and Marie still actually like each other, although that's heavily debatable. The two discuss a lot of things that make for interesting post-movie discussions, particularly about art and art criticism, but they spend most of their time digging deep at each other's insecurities and hitting hard whenever they feel even slightly attacked. Malcolm, in particular, is frighteningly volatile, especially showcased in a scene when he reads a review that praises his film but for what he perceives as the wrong reasons, and he goes on a multi-minute rant cursing all reviewers while Marie laughs, because for once tonight his rage isn't aimed at her. The film doesn't wow me, but the performances are good, and it made me pay attention. The Mitchells vs. the Machines is an animated adventure film about a family where the aspiring filmmaker daughter and the technology-phobic father don't particularly get along, but then they all have to band together to save the world when cell phone artificial intelligence takes over and plans to destroy all humans. This is a delightful watch. It's full of creativity and laughs and vivid characters that are still all somehow rare in children's films outside of Disney and Pixar. The way the film uses animation is especially creative, leaning more into comic book or anime-style methods of depicting emotion, sound, and tension through visuals, and it works spectacularly. There's so many moments where this movie took me by surprise and made me laugh out loud, which I wasn't expecting, as well as having a tremendous amount of heart to it. There's so much to admire about this movie that it should have been just a full-on transcendent film experience, and it wasn't quite, but I can't pinpoint anything that was actually missing. Maybe I just need to give it another rewatch someday, and in the meantime, I'm happy to recommend it, even if it's more with my head than my heart. The Mauritanian is the story of a real-life man who was captured and held in Guantanamo Bay for years on suspicion of being connected to the 9/11 attacks, but without ever being formally charged with a crime. The story picks up in the late 2000s when an ACLU lawyer decides to fight for his release. The film follows both his defense and prosecuting attorney as they make their way through the layers of secrecy about Gitmo prisoners. Remembering that this is something that actually happened, and is still happening for others in Gitmo, makes this a really uncomfortable watch. Not in a bad way, it's just uncomfortable. Benedict Cumberbatch's incredibly southern accent is also uncomfortable, although to an entirely different degree, and he does a good job of conveying the moral arc of his character, as does Jodie Foster for hers. Tahar Rahim is compelling as well, but disappointingly, it's not really his story, and I wish it was more. The script does a really good job of pacing the way the story unfolds and holding the audience's interest as they watch to see what actually happened. It's an interesting and thought-provoking movie handled fairly well, though I really do wish it centered more on Rahim's character than the lawyer's. They All Laughed is the story of a group of detectives who spy on married women for their husbands who suspect them of infidelity. But really, what this movie reminds me of most is those ambient Yule log or sidewalk cafe videos, but for surveillance. I feel like fully 60% of the film is just silently watching people walk around the city following each other. The other 40% is borderline nonsense, farcical romantic flings. The character dynamics here are so bizarre that I can't track who wants what. Nobody behaves consistently from moment to moment. There are several moments that seem comedic, particularly John Ritter's scenes, but everything surrounding them is so incomprehensible that I'm not even entirely sure they are meant to be comedic. About halfway through, I think I said out loud to myself, what am I even watching? It's especially disappointing considering some of my favorite comedies of all time are directed by Peter Bogdanovich, so my response isn't anger or boredom so much as just the befuddled thought of, what happened? It's a strange, messy, confusing movie that I'd have been just as happy not watching. Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox Story, is a comedy biopic starring John C. Reilly as fictional musician Dewey Cox, following his rise and fall, years of drug use, multiple marriages, and childhood trauma that fueled his art. This was a lot more entertaining than I'd have ever expected it to be. There are so many small, subtle jokes, like the ever-increasing number of babies Kristen Wiig has, and they don't have attention called to them, but it made me smile. The music's pretty good too. Riley's a pretty competent pop rock performer, and the songs are just cheesy enough to make them fit into a parody film, but just realistic enough to be pretty genuinely enjoyable. As with many comedies more than a few years old, there are a few moments that have not aged well, especially regarding some racial stereotype characters, but since the movie relies more on wacky absurdity than cultural references, most of it still works. Riley also does a great job of staying within the character enough that you never feel like he's winking at the camera, and that holds it all together nicely. I can't say the same for Jenna Fisher, who's not giving her best performance here, but overall, I liked it much more than I expected. A Soldier's Sweetheart is based on a short story by Tim Burns about a U.S. Army medic in Vietnam during the Vietnam War who manages to get his girlfriend flown out to stay with him. They slowly drift apart as she finds more and more sympathy for the local villagers. The most interesting part of this movie is definitely just the general narrative core, which was just as interesting in the original short story. However, when it comes to the actual filmmaking, there are some bizarre choices. I really want to call out the camera work. It vacillates between traditional stable camera shots and wildly unstable camera movements, and not in the way a film might be using deliberately to simulate the feeling of being there. More like whoever was holding the camera just kept losing their balance and staggering to the side to try to regain it, and then they just used that take anyway. At first I thought maybe it was the crappy VHS transfer quality of the version I was watching on YouTube, but I think those are deliberate camera choices, and they're baffling. Everything in between the core story, which is great, and the cinematography, which is awful, is just okay. I vote read the short story, skip the movie. Jesus Christ Superstar is the film version of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's musical about the life of Jesus. It takes a fourth wall-breaking approach to the narrative. It features a group of actors traveling to the desert, performing the show, and traveling back. It's a creative choice that really lets the performances and cinematography shine, and they do. This movie is a visual treat, and Carl Anderson as Judas is especially electrifying, with really incredible renditions of Heaven on Their Minds and Damned for All Time. Where the film maybe lacks a bit is the problem with the original musical source itself. Gethsemane is a great tune, but it only works for me out of the context of the show, because in context, Jesus is the most unlikable, pettiest character in musical theater history, and it's almost impossible to empathize with him. Maybe that's intended just to solidify Judas as our protagonist, but then we get just so much Jesus in the story, and I get antsy for it to pass. So as always, whenever I watch Jesus Christ Superstar, I have to go rewatch some Godspell to cleanse my palate. But if you love the show, the film is a great production of it, and I would recommend it. The United States vs. Billie Holiday is, well, a Billie Holiday biopic, focusing primarily on her life through the lens of her battle with the US government over her song Strange Fruit, a song about lynchings of Black Americans in the South. While they can't overtly stop her from singing the song, they can, and do, use every tool they have to get her arrested for illegal drug use, including planting drugs on her. The story follows her over years, during which she is continually harassed by federal agents stalking her, interrogating people around her, and threatening her career in the hopes of getting her to keep quiet. Andra Day carries this movie impressively, showing Holiday as a fully fleshed-out, complicated woman, capable of both great generosity and great selfishness. It makes her story more engaging than a lot of biopics are, and it's a sobering look at how far our government has been willing to go, and can be willing to go, to avoid looking bad. The musical performances are great, particularly when we do finally get to hear Strange Fruit in its entirety. This is worth a watch, especially if this is an era of history that's fairly unfamiliar to you, as it was to me. The Swan Princess is an animated children's movie about a prince and princess from neighboring kingdoms who are brought up expecting to marry each other. But when they're old enough to have a say in the matter, the princess's father is killed and she is kidnapped by an evil villain who, I guess, curses her to turn into a swan and only lets her be a human on moonlit nights, and this is going to persuade her to marry him? His plot is a little confusing, and it's one of many pieces in this story that just don't seem to make any sense. The time frame of this movie is exceptionally weird, and the rules of the spell are so unclear, and the sidekicks pop up out of nowhere and are just expected to be understood that they're there, and the romance sets up an obstacle that then vanishes for no reason. It's just all a strange, messy Disney knockoff. The songs are all pretty decent, though not terribly catchy, and the voice acting is solid, and the animation, while not noteworthy, is at least clear and not obnoxious. I could see being into this as a young child, but as an adult, it leaves me pretty cold. Immortal Beloved is a biopic about Ludwig van Beethoven, specifically focusing on the mystery that arose after the posthumous discovery of a letter he'd written addressed to his immortal beloved. In the film version, Beethoven's effects are left to this woman, so his lawyer interviews several women the composer was rumored to be involved with, trying to find which one the letter referred to. This letter did exist in real life, although the answer of who it was for has never been answered as decisively as this film chooses to answer it. This movie is mostly just a lavish romance wrapped up in the trappings of being a movie about a composer. Beethoven's music features prominently throughout the score, and there are a few scenes of him working, but most of it centers around the drama and mystery of his life, and that's handled awkwardly. At one point, characters are explaining flashbacks to each other that they were there for. Gary Oldman is pretty great as Beethoven, though. Not quite enough to drum up enough sympathy for his character and how badly he treats some of the women. I'm not as interested as I used to be in the plight of the tortured genius who treats people badly, so I was dissatisfied with the film's overall goal. It's no Amadeus. Stowaway is a sci-fi thriller about 3 astronauts on a mission to Mars, who find an unexpected passenger who is knocked unconscious before takeoff and never made it back off the ship. They can't turn back now, so they agree to continue on with him, but things start going wrong with the life support systems, and it becomes clear they might not all be able to survive. So it turns out that movies where people are just hanging out in space without a spaceship terrify me. I had the same visceral reaction to this that I did to the movie Gravity, and it occasionally made me just too nervous to keep watching. Aside from that, it's a well-written, solid thriller, with a few absolutely chilling reveals as their options grow more limited, and it does a really great job of pulling his audience into the ethical question. Like, I feel the dilemma, in a way every other film wants me to feel theirs. And when a movie hooked you in like that, it really pays off. I found the final resolution very moving, and had to just sit with it for a while afterward. Keep an eye out for this one, it's worth a watch.